Right, anyway, here we go. So in this talk, which huge apologies for being slightly delayed, it explores the topic of death and the Maiden quite broadly, including erotic death art imagery and the gender of death. Now, this is a huge topic, so to keep it contained, I'm going to largely be sticking to Europe and also focusing mostly on visual imagery. Some context to the visual representation of death seemed like a good place to start. So first to these images. The imagery here is moral in tone and reflects the biblical story of how death came into the world. These are the two opening woodcuts from the famous Holbein's Dance of Death series, which dates to 1523 to 1525. They're significant because they show biblically how, in the opening woodcut, death came into the world through the fall and the sin of disobedience to God. And in the second image, how women are effectively responsible for continuing this fallen life. As you can see here, death is a skeleton, ungendered, and a signifier to show how the expulsion comes human mortality. So we become mortal after the fall. Although this Dance of Death series is quite late in terms of the genre, it clearly links the biblical stories, and we have a link biblically between sex and death, and also between immanence and transcendence, the earthly and the spiritual, the here and now and the ever after. Culturally fascinating, the marriage of sex and death in Europe has a long history, often related to the wider socio-political and religious climate of the time. The communications scholar Paul Massaris has suggested that visual images, quote, make a persuasive communication due to iconicity, the emotional response to the visual image presented, close quote. And in this talk, I aim to explore with you the iconicity of erotic death-related artworks, and also artworks that gender death. But first, to some history. The earliest European images of death come in two connected genres, the three living and the three dead, and the Dance of Death. The moral to both was that death is ubiquitous, and we should live in this world thinking of how our earthly actions reflect what will happen to us in the next world. They're both known as memento mori, variously translated as remember death or remember you will die. The upper image shows three living men coming face to face with their deceased counterparts. If you look carefully, you will see that the living and the dead almost mirror each other. The inner characters point, almost touching fingers, whilst the outer characters have the same stance. The I was as you are and as I am you shall be lesson from the dead is crystal clear. But we shall return to this image shortly and unpack it a little more. In the Dance of Death, that's the images below, the dead are slightly different in their memento mori lesson, for they inform that no matter what your age or social status, death will come to you. In the image on the right, we see death being quite gentle. Death, it seems, tenderly encourages the old friar, helping him on his way. And there almost seems to be a look of regret on death's face. And with the young child in its crib, death holds out a hand in a parental manner, looking at the child with head bowed. Now compare this to the images on the left. Death here takes all that the canon and the merchant has. They lived lives of plenty, but when death came, there was no escape. But as you can see, death seems pretty happy about taking these two away. It appears that the wealthy were more in need of the reminder that they should remember death, and that their afterlife depends on their actions in this life. In relation to the wealthy, the Bible states, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. As such, those with money were automatically at a disadvantage spiritually when it came to their afterlife destination. And this is reflected in both of these images. The 15th century Dance of Death from Tallinn, that's the image above, comes from the workshop of Bernd Nocht from Lübeck. It depicts the typical old, young, wealthy and poor set of characters and reinforces that their good deeds will help determine their final fate. Here, though, we see the rich and mighty emperor and empress, both thinking themselves untouchable. Yet death informs the emperor that he let the affairs of the court blind him as his role to defender of the Christian church, and that the youth and noble birth of the empress may give her earthly power, but that power is mortal, and no matter how much she pleads for extra years, her time on earth is over. Unmistakably a pedagogical message, Death the teacher informs all that they must lead good, moral, Christian lives in order to achieve the afterlife destination they desire, one where they effectively become food for worms. Not all Dance of Death murals included female characters though, and the genre started as all male figures. The inclusion of women is believed to have originated in the St Paul's mural in London, which was adapted from the mural at the Parisian Cemetery of the Holy Innocents. John Lydgate, a monk from Bury St Edmunds, was in Paris in 1426, the year after the French mural was completed and translated and brought it over. Lydgate, though, added 5 additional characters to the French ones: a juror, a conjurer, and 3 women, a princess, an abbess, and a noblewoman. Although the London mural never survived, Lydgate's Middle English text does. Women were included in some versions of the 3 living, 3 dead, such as the 14th century version shown here. Now, I'd like to explore this particular image with you in more detail, as it really hammers home the theological message of Memento Mori, but also, I think, has one very interesting visual feature. So, as with the earlier all-male 3 living, 3 dead, we see mirroring going on. The 2 inner images look at each other, and the inner pairs make contact with their living counterparts. The living women hold hands, and the dead also touch. Note how the second woman looks down, and one has her hand to her chest. The dead figure does likewise. Both the outer figures stand slightly aloof. She, looking slightly upwards, her gaze raised to heaven, whilst the dead figure looks out to us. Here is a very early example of what is known as a direct gaze, a look that breaks, in film terminology, the 4th wall. The look engages us, the viewer. It breaks a performance convention. It reaches out to us, not as somebody passively watching, but as somebody now actively engaged in the scene. And this is important. This particular book illustration tells the reader, viewer, that they need to be actively engaged in thoughts of the afterlife. Nothing can save them from death. Wealth and social status mean not a jot when time is up. Now I want to digress for a moment here before returning to Memento Mori theme and considering death and gender. Not yet the gender of death, but gender and death. If we go back to the fall and Adam and Eve, then it's evident that the actions of the first pair brought us death and hard labour in all senses of the word. But for reasons I don't have time to go into here, women were considered more weak-willed than men. Women were more susceptible to the influence of Satan, more earthy, more fecund, more vain, and more connected with sin. And we see this here, and how sin led to and continues to lead to death. The young woman is surrounded by symbols of frippery and hedonism: music, fruit, money, decadent attire. She symbolises vanitas and voluptas, transient light, life and earthly pleasure. And the 2 men that accompany her are no different. She might grasp the coins of the older man, but he grasps her breast. And the younger guy appears transfixed by her beauty, completely oblivious to her actions and thoughts, because she's certainly not looking at him, but at that fruit platter. This is mercenary love. She will take what she can get. The artist, Urs Graf, was a prolific printmaker and is known for his sardonic approach to depicting women. He was also in front of the authorities in Bâle a number of times for beating his wife and for other offences, so it's clear that there's a bias to his somewhat misogynistic work. But I place it here as an example of the typical perception of women in this era. It's important to note that women were symbols of earthiness at this time. They signified sex, vanity, and the transience and temptations of our mortal life. So back briefly to the 3 living, 3 dead, because I want to note that while women had this inherent link to our brief and fecund existence on earth, men were not always seen as paragons of virtue. It was sin and sin alone that determined one's afterlife. And here you see both images of the 3 living, 3 dead, and you can see I've marked out that both contain a falcon, which was a symbol of sexual organs at the time. And it appears in, as I said, both illustrations. You can see with the blue arrow where it are. Now, both sexes here then are tainted by original sin. They have a lot to make up for. Now, the next section moves from our genderless imagery of death to death personified. I'm going to start with Albrecht Dürer, because as far as I can tell, it was he that initiated, or at least was an early exponent, of the visual genre of death as a noun rather than a verb, an action. And I posit that this change comes with the theological debates that resulted in the Reformation. Dürer was born a Catholic, and whilst it's believed he never totally abandoned his faith, he appeared to have had reformist sympathies. Although artist to the Holy Roman Emperor, he had contacts with various reformers and is known to have been sympathetic to Lutheranism. As such, Dürer would have known about the theological debates around death, for purgatory as an afterlife destination was a key area of tension between the Catholics and the reformers. With the reformist thrust toward individualism, it's perhaps no surprise that in Dürer's work we find the beginnings of a new oeuvre of artistic representation of death. Death and the Maiden, a woman alone with a clearly male symbol of mortality. Drawing on Augustinian thought, which had a notable impact on the stance of reformers such as Luther, death was typically understood as male and connected to Adam, whereas life and lust was female and connected to Eve. In German, the language of the Reformation, the connection between death and the male is clear, der or Herr Tod, Mr. Death. But the biblical link comes from Romans 5:12, where we find Adam clearly blamed for bringing sin and death into the world. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. In this image, we see death, a slightly wild-looking, possibly naked, because we can't actually tell what he's got on, man in the early stages of taking a young woman. As it says, ravishing. There is a very clearly sexual overtones to this image, but thinking about its theological undertones, you can see that the young woman, although she tries to escape from death's predatory grasp, has her left hand very gently resting on death's hand. You can just about make that out. It's almost as if she knows the inevitability of her fate. Death will take her, and as such, she can't fully resist. In this slightly later image by Dürer, we again see death, this time dressed, but facially still pretty wild looking, and in fact his hair appears to be home to snakes. Snakes, of course, being the symbol of sin, and especially the sin of the fall. Death, too, holds an hourglass, a symbol of life's transience. But in contrast to the maiden who tries to flee death's grasp, the knight here acts as a paragon of virtue, steadfast and righteous, embodying goodly and godly action, and thus heading confidently toward his eventual demise with Mr. Death and a dog, the signifier of fidelity, as his companions. Now, what complicates this image is that there are credible arguments that the snake in Eden and the devil were the same, and here we see the snake and the devil separated. However, we must remember that Dürer was an artist and not a theologian, and also that not all theologians understood the snake as the devil. But this line of thought is a bit of a distraction, so I'm going to leave that there. But what I would like to highlight is, as you can see from this pair, there is a bit of a misogynistic edge to how Dürer's two individuals, the knight and the maiden, deal with coming to death. Now, I don't have time to go into the whys and wherefores, but suffice to note that woman equals Eve, and as such, life and lust, with all its earthly and sinful temptation, and man equals Adam, and thus death. Death is not only the eventual stealer away of youth, beauty, and fecundity, as embodied in the maiden, but the wild, untamable nature of the grim reaper. Someone that, whilst we, like the maiden, might try to reject, but who ultimately becomes our intimate. And thus we need to be more like the knight, lead a virtuous life, and accept our end graciously. Both woodcuts, therefore, are pedagogical. Now, in order to fully grasp the meaning of the Reformation-era death and the maiden images, it's important to fully grasp their religious subtext. So just to be really clear, central to Christianity is the fall. The tale is told in Genesis, where we find that because of the sin of disobedience against the commandment of God not to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve, the first humans, were banished from paradise to an existence on earth. Here, Adam must toil the land and Eve bear children painfully. Both effectively endure hard labour. And whilst life is eternal in paradise, on earth we have a mortal existence. But the apportion of sin here is complex, for only Adam was told by God not to eat the forbidden fruit. And whilst Eve was tempted into the act by the serpent, the actual disobedience against God's words was in effect Adam's, with, as noted, Romans 5:12 squarely blaming Adam for bringing death into the world. Augustine's work on the theology of the Reformers was based on the New Testament, which took precedence over the words of the Christian Old Testament. Thus, whilst we could argue that in Genesis both Adam and Eve committed sin, and because of the fall and the bringing about of death, that's one thing. But because of this epistle to Romans, and that was composed in Jesus' time by the Apostle Paul, it was given greater weight and significance for the Reformers, ensuring that death and its consequences did fall with Adam. Therefore, as you can see hopefully from these images, man signifies death. Now in the two Cranach the Elder paintings, we see the fall represented. And in the Grian one, we see visually how Adam becomes death. Now note that the snake bites the first pair. I'll come back to this image later and talk more about its significance. However, whilst Adam is symbolic of death, Eve signifies life. Notably with Eve, or woman, in the Death and the Maiden images, we typically find illustrated, often quite explicitly, female sexuality. This notion can be seen in the Grian painting, where Eve has a very knowing, cheeky little smile. It might be useful at this point, though, to give a brief explanation behind the perception of the overt sexuality of women during this period of history. During this time in European culture, women were typically perceived as signifiers of wantage, of pleasure and the unruly, with books such as the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, reinforcing the general view that women were weaker in faith than men and thus more likely to sin. They were inherently more carnal. Inherent in Reformed thought was that marriage was blessed, and non-marital sex, including homosexual relations, were bad for the soul, the family, fortune and honour. Indeed, Luther described the unmarried state as poison to the government and the world. Thus, autonomous females were considered especially dangerous. And we can see this clearly reflected in the drawing by the Beam brothers. Seaborg Beam is one of the Reformist artists I'll explore a little later. But here we see death is present at a ritual of female mutual masturbation, a didactic image that represented normative notions of women as signifiers of unacceptable fleshy desire. With the artistic signifiers of the day somewhat clarified, women understood as symbols of lust and life, and death identified as male, we can move on to the three most significant artists of this particular genre and explore their politics in the Death and the Maiden images. Here we see part of a fresco by Deutsch. Nicholas Manuel Deutsch was a German-speaking Swiss religious reformer who used art to express his religious and political activism. Between 1515 and 1520, Deutsch painted a large fresco for the Bernese Dominicans in the tradition of Dance of Death. This mural, this particular scene from the mural, provides the only erotic image of Death and the Maiden in the Dance of Death genre, and it links Deutsch directly with the Reformation due to his attack on the evils of the Catholic Church in the text that was written underneath the images. It should be noted that none of this text went beyond the acceptable limits of the day, though. And amongst the evils quoted were abuse of the Mass, the belief in purgatory, and the payment of indulgences. Notably, less than a decade after producing this fresco, Deutsch came on to be a leading politician in Bern, where belief in purgatory was abolished in 1528. His political writings speak powerfully of his reformist beliefs, including his assertion that lust, swearing and frivolity should not be tolerated. Indeed, he went so far to state that, quote, "How fine a thing it would be if you could easily forswear the world and recognise how greatly sin parts us from God," close quote. Now, this death and the maiden image potently clarifies his feelings towards worldliness and pedagogically situates the vanity of beauty and the sin of lust. It demonstrates that humanity may have its tempting earthly pleasures. Note the Baroque architecture and the ribbons at the woman's knee. But at death, we must each account for our sins before God, and therefore it is to the afterlife that we should turn our attentions. The Bible preached simplicity, and this was a key part of the Reformist movement. And for Deutsch, his evangelical Anabaptism, that's adult Baptist belief, led him to give up his art and concentrate on following in the footsteps of Jesus, working for the poor and oppressed. And notably, part of his work in public service included petitioning for an organised welfare state. Further clarifying the link between sin and life and a concern for death is the work of Hans Baldwin, who was the most prolific of the reformist artists working in the death and the maiden genre. Most notable among his images are Girl and Death and Woman and Death. As with Deutsch's work, the young woman stands alone while death takes her. She's a symbol of voluptus, pleasure, young, beautiful, fleshy, in the prime of life and essentially fecund. The association of voluptus with vanitas, the transience of life, is evident from the words above the 1517 image, "Here must you go," but can be seen more clearly from his earlier representations. The Three Ages of Women depicts the vanity of youth. The girl is ignorant of death, as is the young woman in the 1515 drawing next door, whereas the old woman seeks to stave off death's hourglass. Notable here is the gendering of death, with a rag-like flesh in place of the genitals. Death is clearly male, and indeed many of Baldwin's imagery from this time resonates with the Adam equals male equals death, Eve equals life equals woman link. The vanitas and voluptus of earthly life, that is the tempting pleasures and the transience of human existence on earth, is furthered by Grian in a slightly later work. Here again we see a maiden at her toilet. She's arranging her hair in a vanity glass whilst death holds her. Note how he's not grasping though, like Dürer's Death as the Ravisher. He almost touches her tenderly as a lover might, like Adam might touch Eve. Now in these four images we see the fall, and there is similarly positioned Adam and Eve images. The position of death in the death and the maiden ones. Both Adam and death approach the female subject from behind. However, whereas Adam tends to caress, death tends to grasp. Have we seen on the previous slide, there's a fuzziness between Adam and death that cements the overall reading as man as both death and Adam. Perhaps of more significance in relation to the link between Eve as life, Adam as death, and the fall is the metaphor of the bite. In all of these fall images, Eve holds an apple, and Luther himself stated that most people believe that death just happens, but scripture teaches us that death comes from the bite of the forbidden fruit. Now in Latin, mors is death, whereas morsus is bite, providing a literary and artistic pun that you can see in these two of Grian's paintings. In the 1519 painting, death is literally biting the maiden. And in the 1512 one, as previously noticed, you'll see that the snake is biting Adam, death, whilst Eve holds the snake's tail. This Adam and Eve, death and woman link can be seen in the last of our reformist artists. Here we find two images by Sebald Beum, one of the so-called godless painters. In 1525, Beum was briefly expelled from Nuremberg for heresy against Lutheranism, who he believed had not gone far enough with religious reforms. Beum had a personal theology based on the iconoclasm of the theologian Andreas von Kallstadt, who thought it was good, necessary, laudable and godly to do away with images. The political and religious extremism of the radical preacher Thomas Münster, who was the leader of the Peasants' War and supporter of workers' rights, and also on the centrality of personal salvation, which was developed by Ulrich Zwingli, the leader of the Reformation in Switzerland. So Beum's work would potently reflected this radical reformism of the time. For Sebald Beum, each individual was responsible for his own sins, and it was the fall that brought sexual desire and death into the world. And that's really clear in these images. This was most clearly expressed, though, in his 1541 work, The Hour is Over. In this image, we are taken explicitly into realms of arousal. He deliberately places the woman's genitals centre stage, and if you actually folded this image into four, you would see that her vulva is exactly dead centre. Death grins lecherously. We genuinely have no choice but to be voyeurs to this image. We're completely confronted here by our sinful and our sexual natures. And note the chamber pot under the bed. This woodcut is altogether earthy and calls us to reflect on our own fallen condition, where the needs of the body are dominant. Now, you might argue that death here is ungendered. Certainly most images in the death and the maiden genre tend to picture death as an enfleshed or partly enfleshed being that's clearly male. But if you look at the gaze of death, which is slightly lecherous, and the aggressive posture, the lascivious leering, it's highly suggestive of the heteronormative masculinity of that particular era. In 1541, Behan produced this woodcut, Death and the Standard Naked One, which highlights the folity of vanitas. The image sums up reformist art. Renaissance woman may take centre stage, young, beautiful, fecund, surrounded by the glories of earthly materiality, and you can see the city in the background. But all of these things will go to nothing when death annihilates her, and thus us. These images of death, physically molesting or eyeing up a young, vain female, or sometimes a slightly willing woman of perhaps loose morals, was designed specifically to make the viewers of these works contemplate their sinful and sexual nature. And at this time, most viewers would have been male. These artistic supporters of the Reformation wanted their audience to reach into their souls and examine what they found there. For they firmly believed that once those who looked upon these works realised their afterlife destination was dependent only on their earthly deeds and the grace of God, rather than the amount they could pay to the Catholic Church in indulgences to buy them remissions from the pain of purgatory, the sexual arousal these images would produce would bring home that death was ever present, and that their fleshy desires could lead to an afterlife in hell, rather than a few extra years in purgatory. So far, all the images I've shown depict death as either genderless or as male. But as you can see here, one of these images is death as female. Now, this woodcut comes from the Dance of Death series produced by Deutsch, again, one of the German-speaking Little Masters, like Grian and Sibyl Behan. And it is quite unusual. It shows a cannon being taken off by an elderly female figure of death. Here, in many ways, the canon experiences the ultimate final humiliation. He's a Roman Catholic being led away effectively by a hag, a reviled, aged woman. Talk about adding insult to injury. The politics, therefore, of these images are totally fascinating, being theologically laden as well as reflecting perceptions of sex and gender. Now, although the previous images showing death as female is unusual, it is unusual because it was produced in a country where death linguistically is male. In countries where death linguistically is female, unsurprisingly, death was imaged as female. However, in many of these countries, there was not a strong culture of visual imagery of death. And so I'm very briefly going to shift my focus from visual imagery and think about written text. Now, the Italian poet Petrarch, in his poem Trifonio della Morte, which is the third of his Trifonio series, dating to 1340 to 74, described death as a woman shrouded in a black dress, furious, ruthless, pitiless. Imagery of death based on Petrarch's work, particularly in France where his work was very popular, saw death visualised as a long-haired woman wielding a scythe, or stood on a chariot draped with cloth and hung with skulls and bones. Beneath its wheels were the living, bodies of the living and the dead. Here then, death is not sexually predatory male, typical of the Germanic depictions, but a fierce and wild woman. The perception of death in this form can also be found in the Polish text shown here, Mr. Polycarp's Dialogue with Death. Written in the early 15th century, what remains of the original, which is an incomplete copy from around 1463 to 65, presents a variety of scenes in which a conversation takes place between Mr. Polycarp, an educated man, and Death. Wielding a scythe, Death is pale, skinny, bald, and hideously ugly, a rotting yellowish corpse missing the tip of her nose and blood oozing from her eyes. Death informs Polycarp that he should not be afraid of her until she comes for him. She states she will come for everyone eventually, and that she was inside the forbidden fruit that Eve gave to Adam. So once Adam ate of the fruit, he was destined to die and bring death into the world. Death states how much she loves human sin and names a variety of occupations and types of people, asserting she will have them all and will avenge every one of their crimes, their sins. In many ways, this poem resembles the dance of death in the variety of individuals noted, and as such it should be understood as part of this European trope. The dance of death trope, but in the literary, not visual form, can also be found in the Spanish danka, which dates to the 15th or early 16th century. Just as didactic as its continental and English equivalents, the danka poetry used a preacher's voice in the prologue to inform the readers to take heed of the poem's advice. The prologue effectively emphasised the vanity of earthly materiality which caused moral decay, and the poem featured a number of characters from across society being taken to their death. In these elements, it differed little from the Northern European dance of death that focused visually and textually on the inevitability of death. However, linguistically, the danka added some depth to the overall genre. In the danka, when death addresses the night, the term athiona, meaning occupation, is used. And here occupation means not just one's job of work, but also the work of grieving. The term accentuates the sorrow and monotony of humans' eternal dance of death. Comprised only of male characters, in the danka each laments the pleasures he must leave behind, expresses fear of the unknown, and despairs that he has not accepted the reality of death before the moment of his demise. Death confirms and affirms this before moving on to the next character, and so the verbal dance continues. What is interesting here is that the French dance of death, a genderless female skeletal figure, takes away living males, but it is an ugly woman. And the theme of ugly women takes us back to this image by Death, where Death was depicted again as an ugly woman. So you can see that when there are depictions of Death as a woman, on the whole, it is Death as an ugly elderly woman. Whereas when you've got depictions of Death as male, on the whole, he might be slightly wild, but he's certainly not seen as sort of in the same way that the women are. Now, I've touched on the heteronormativity of historic Death and the Maiden images. They work because of the Adam equals death, Eve equals life link. And where we have the skeletal death in the art genre, it's pretty evident from looking at the positioning and the face that Death is male. And with Eve signifying life and materiality, and therefore standing in many ways for all of us, we today can even understand how these images speak to us to the need to remember that we can't escape death. But what of more modern images in this genre, particularly those produced in a time when religion is not as powerful in everyday life and when notions of the afterlife are questionable? In our more secular society, does death have a gender? And if so, what is it? Could death even be transgender? And if there's a link between death and sex, then could death be homosexual, bisexual, non-sexual? So to close, I want to muse on some of the more recent Death and the Maiden imagery. Here we see two images by Edward Munch. Titled Death and Life, they show a couple kissing, surrounded by semen and fetuses. Here death has to be male, and the reproductive element of the images cements the Death and the Maiden images as heteronormative and sexual. Here death is not the end, but it seems death is the beginning. Without death, there cannot be life, and therefore we can also read death, Adam, life, Eve into these works. Munch was son of a fundamental Christian doctor and a child whose mother died when he was just 5 years old. His childhood illnesses were branded as a punishment from God to be answered by penitential prayer and remorseful submission. And shortly after his 70th birthday, Munch stated that he was born dying and that death was the dark angel that followed him throughout life. It's perhaps then easy to see why for Munch, death and life and sex are intimately entwined. Now, the next death and the maiden imagery I want to show you sees the relationship between death and the maiden in very different ways. There's still an intimacy between the pair, but in the conversation, death appears to be talking to the woman. She sat on the bed, partly covered by a bedsheet, and it seems resigned to her fate. Her fist to her chin, her pose is redolent of Rodin's The Thinker. But similarly to the Three Living, Three Dead, the maiden and death are posed in a very similar way. This appears to be a modern mix of Death and the Maiden and the Three Living and Three Dead, but a bit of a pared down version. And if you look carefully at the legs, you can see the positioning of the legs is virtually identical. Also the shoulders and the outstretched arm. Now, a more recent Death and the Maiden painting seems to have a different tone, but I really liked seeing the boredom of the pair here. Whereas the Devereux painting can easily be read as resident of wartime worldview, the Eisman work of 2009 seems to speak with our uneasy relationship with talking about or even acknowledging that death exists. Just like the maiden here, for most of us in Northern Europe, death is something we cannot ignore. Note that death lightly rests his hand on hers, but death is something we don't particularly want to interact with. Of course, though, with COVID-19, this has changed it, and it will be interesting to see how this particular genre of art might represent our current pandemic. But if we cast our mind back to pre-COVID times, then in Northern Europe, it was often said in the media that death was denied. Death study scholar would largely query this, noting that death is frequently a subject of books, filming, and gaming. However, these interactions with death are second-hand, and few people would regularly see a dead body. In a way, I guess, we felt we had as a society sort of triumphed over death, as death was often encountered in our own terms, physically in a morgue or metaphorically through the media. And thus the notion of triumphing over death is the topic of this rather wonderful series of woodcuts by Budzinski. Given this is just post-World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic, there is a wonderful hopefulness here. Now, death asks the maiden to dance. She does, and in doing so, she dances with him. And if you look at the picture at the end, she dances death to death and comes out victorious. And this turning tables on death can be seen in these two playful photographs in the Death and the Maiden genre by a Polish manufacturer of coffins in an annual calendar that they produce. Here we see a maiden subduing death in an erotic BDSM scenario, and the maiden as the Grim Reaper, although she's a young and attractive one rather than death in Mr. Polycarp. I don't want to linger on these images as I know some may find them offensive, but if you're interested, you can Google coffin calendar girls and read my work on erotic coffin calendar art in more depth. Now, just before I finish, I wish to end away from Europe and move to Latin America, where death linguistically is female. Here we see La Santa Muerta. She's the bony lady, who is a popular vernacular saint in Mexico, although her reach is growing. She is the saint of the narcos, and as such, one side of her cult is deeply problematic. But she's also highly popular with everyday people who often live with death in a way that until COVID-19, most of us in Northern Europe and the Western world just can't imagine. If anyone wishes to read up on her, then I can recommend the works of Professor Andrew Chestnut. So, to finish, we've looked at death as ungendered, as male and as female, the connection of sex and death through the fall, and also the hope for our triumph over mortality. Now, I've just scratched the surface of this fascinating topic and simplified some very complex ideas, but I hope you've enjoyed my brief run through of death and the maiden imagery. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Tina. That was brilliant. And
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Coming in, people have really enjoyed this lecture and they've learned a lot. So everyone, we're about going to question time. So this is the opportunity you have now to put your questions to Tina. We've had a couple come in, so I'm going to dive straight into it. So the first one, Really? So this, I suppose, I'm assuming when we talked, this lady who's commented it, mentions about where does Lilith fit into all of this? So I'm assuming this is the Jewish understanding of Lilith being the first wife of Adam. Does she sort of fit into the idea of death and the Maiden, Tina?
Not particularly. I mean, you're talking about a particularly different genre of art. So if you're talking about Lilith, there's loads of different ways of understanding her. So you can understand her in a sort of second wave feminist understanding as sort of a kick-ass woman that is the only person to call God by God's name. And, you know, you've got that idea of demonizing. She's also prominent in Hasidic, so Orthodox Jewish theology through the Zohar, where when men, because in Judaism, you're not allowed to spill the seed. So if men have nocturnal emissions, it's because Lilith has come to them. Got to blame the woman, not the man. So there's that side. And you've also got her as the screech owl. So there's a whole variety of things where she is connected with death, because in some myths, she's understood as living outside of Eden, because she was kicked out. She was Adam's first wife, for those who don't know or believe to be. She complained about lying underneath Adam to have sex. He complained to God. God kicked her out effectively. She called God by his name. He wasn't very happy. And in some understandings, she basically comes and steals away babies. So if you go to the Welcome, which is now open, I believe, the Welcome in London, the Welcome collection, they've got, and you can find this online as well, sort of like little charms that Jewish Hasidic women will have when they're coming up to childbirth, and hold as well in the first little while of a baby's life to protect them from Lilith. So there is a connection, but you don't tend to find that in these Death and the Maiden images.
Now, and that's really interesting when you mentioned about the screech owl, because if for those of you interested in Bible translations, if you read the King James Bible, I think it's in Isaiah, where actually the Greek is translated into the King James English version as using the screech owl. So we do see that when it's translated, sort of Lilith's name doesn't exist in the English Bible text. As Tina said, there's different names that are attributed to her. Moving on, we've had a question, I think it's a really interesting one, is that, are there any examples of Death and the Maiden artworks that can be attributed to female artists, Tina?
Well, some of the ones that I showed later, the sort of, you know, looking at that last section, are indeed by women. So yeah, there are. I mean, obviously the Reformation ones, or proto, largely proto-Reformation, particularly the Little Masters, are 3 men. And the ones before that, we don't really know, because we don't have provenance. Women did in the medieval era sculpt, paint, do all of that sort of stuff, but you know, we just don't necessarily know always who they are. Also, you do find some sort of vernacular paintings. So there's a church in Wales whose name's just gone straight out of my head, which is very annoying. Yeah, it's gone straight out of my head, which is almost like got a one living, one dead. So you see a dandy inside the church, and he's holding hands with a partly shrouded skeleton in the recess of the window that's pointing out to the graveyard. We don't know who painted that. It's very clearly a local artist, you know, somebody who, yeah, it's quite base, it's quite homespun. That's a good word for it, homespun. But of course, we don't know who painted it. There's nothing to tell us whether it was a man or a woman. We often make assumptions that it's men, but that's not necessarily the case. But certainly a lot of these more recent images are actually, you know, a good deal of them are by women. There's also photography, although the main photographers seem to be male. But it's, you know, I wouldn't say they're definitely it's only a male preserve.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tina, for that. And staying with the theme of women here, we know certainly in a lot of our churches, certain parts of churches were dedicated to churching liturgy. So for those of you unfamiliar, churching was a special liturgy that after a woman had a successful delivery, she would go back to church to be rechurched. Is there any acknowledgement in any of the Death and Maiden artworks showing, you know, this cause, you know, a high percentage of death in young women was childbirth during this period?
No, I mean, that wasn't really what they were trying to show. So if you've got the 3 living, 3 dead and the Dance of Death genre, they genuinely just showed that everybody died. That was it. It was just remember death. So you can sort of park that to one side. It wouldn't really matter what you died of. Everybody dies. Death comes to everybody. When you come to these sort of what are known as the Little Masters, these Death and the Maiden images, these are largely produced by reformist thinkers. So they're artists that have sympathies with the proto-Reformation. Because if you look at some of the dates, it is before Luther. I mean, you know, Luther didn't wake up one morning and go, yeehaw, Reformation time. I mean, you know, you're talking about a very long period of people questioning the theology, particularly when it comes to stuff to do with indulgences and purgatory. So, you know, you've got this sort of political thing going on. And realistically, at this time, the people who would have looked at these images were men. So what they were trying to do, in effect, was excite a man's lust by looking at these sort of erotic, sexualized images and get them to think, well, sex and death, and actually, you know, if purgatory isn't there, am I going to go to hell? You know, maybe I need to think about my own earthly deeds. I need to go for the grace of God. I'll reform. I will move away from being a Catholic and become part of the reformists movement. So that's largely what they were there for, as opposed to anything else. So they were particularly this political, theopolitical genre to target, in effect, sort of, you know, middle class and upwards men who they were hoping to win over to their way.
Thanks, Ina. I think that's a really interesting and fascinating answer there. Thank you for that. So our fourth question here is, do you think the relationship between death and the Maiden could be due to perceived sin, due to Eve's original sin, related to the mortality in childbirth, i.e. The frequency of childbirth mortality? Do you think there's a link there possibly?
It's really difficult to know. I mean, you know, obviously it was more likely that women would die in childbirth. But this is really complicated. I mean, really, really complicated. In terms of things to do with religion, religion likes, on the whole, so organized religion, I'm not just talking about Christianity here, but religion deals very well with closed borders. So if you think of like one of your 1970s cop shows where you've got somebody that's died and they've got this tape round on the floor, and so you've got this taped body, anything that breaches those boundaries is problematic. So things that go in, like food, things that come out, like semen, are problematic. Clearly sex is problematic. You've got things going in and coming out. Childbirth, hugely problematic, but also women's menses. You've got a woman who is bleeding yet not dying. So anything that sort of goes around that is really problematic. So in some ways, yes, because a woman is both a symbol of life and death. She bleeds monthly, but she doesn't die. And she brings about life, but that can kill her or a child. So I'm sure there is a link there, but it's really difficult to know. Certainly for the Reformation period, and the Little Masters, these proto and Reformation artists, they were deeply influenced by Augustinian theology. And Augustine is very clear that death is brought into the world by Adam. Eve continues sinful life. So, you know, we as women are full of earthiness. You know, we continue this sinful life in a way that men don't. And so that demonizes us in a way. So it's sort of a bit yes and a bit no. But, you know, the Reformation, those proto-Reformation reformers, you know, they are thinking much more theopolitically than they are about, you know, why a woman might signify life. It's obvious. Eve means life. You know, that's what the word means. So it's, you know, it might have that further back, but it's just really difficult to tell.
And do you think this ties into Christian understanding of Marian theology? So obviously Eve in Latin is Eva. If you reverse that, it means Ave. And this idea that Mary could be seen as sort of the new, you know, the new Ark of the Covenant, the new life in the New Testament. Do you think there's a link there between, you know, why they used, as you said, Eve in the Old Testament for this sort of continuing sinful life, whereas in the New Testament we have Mary put forward as actually a new life and sort of, you know, gateway for Christ to come into the world? Obviously, without,
yeah.
You know, without with the Immaculate Conception, with that.
That's the problem. It's the Immaculate Conception, you know, and then how does that work? So I don't think that really plays into that particularly, because she isn't a normal woman, or she wasn't conceived of as a normal woman. I mean, literally, she herself wasn't conceived of as a normal way, but, you know, she wasn't, by giving birth to a child that was not conceived through sex, then that child is not tainted by original sin. So it's all really complicated. So I don't think that really works. I think it needs to be understood that woman equals life. She is, and Eve in a way stands for all of us. You know, all of us have vanitas and voluptas. All of us live an earthly existence. So, you know, Eve was also the symbol not just of woman, but of the sin of all of us. She was almost in a way a bit of an everyman figure, but clearly more woman than man, because women at that time were deemed much more capable of being sinful than men, much more carnal, easily tempted, weaker-willed, vain, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So
thanks, Tia. Well, I think we've got time for one more question. I know there's been a lot of questions that come in, but we'll do our best to answer those. We'll come back and we'll come on those questions later on. We'll put them to Tina. But Tina, I think for the last question, I think this is a really nice one to finish on, is that, do you have a favourite depiction of death? Oh, gosh.
That's a really good question. I don't think I do. I mean, I just like the artwork. I mean, I am particularly fond of the work of Grian. I really like the Three Ages of Woman, where you've got this sort of picture of death, who's a raggedy figure, literally, you know, flesh is falling off of him, and his penis is replaced by some raggy flesh. So it really shows that he's male, and you've got this woman sort of trying to stave him off, although, you know, she looks pretty awful if you ask me. And the little child is playing at the feet with an apple, and, you know, it's, I don't know, there's just something I quite like about that depiction, in that it's circular. It sums up the time for me. But I have to say, I've also got a real fondness for the Death and the Maiden image, where the woman's holding a glass of wine and looking really bored, and so's Death. I just think that's a really lovely Death and the Maiden image. It's sort of, you know, yeah, whatever type thing. I quite like that one too.
Well, thanks, Tina, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your comments. Do keep them coming, and as I said, we'll keep an eye on those, and we'll try and put those questions to Tina in an email and get back to you. Now, as we said at the start, please do consider making a donation to support our work. These lectures are free of charge, and we hope you enjoy them. So please do consider texting CCT to 70331, or do go onto our website, where you can make a donation securely, or, as we said at the start, take advantage of our membership offer. Now, next week, we'll be joined once again by Michelle Spike, who's going to be taking us back to Italy as we look further in depth at the life of Matilda of Canossa. Michelle did a lecture with us a few weeks ago about the 100 churches that Matilda of Canossa built. So join us next week for a more in-depth look at the amazing life of this woman who changed the course of, if not just European, but world history. But please do comment below. Let us know what you thought of today's lecture. If you've got any problems joining, do send us a direct message, and we'll do our best to make it as easy as possible for you to join in the future. But thank you so much, Tina, for taking time to join us again. And we look forward to seeing everyone again shortly.